Imagine a cold Moscow night in December 1991. The lights of the Kremlin glow on the frozen river. Inside, a small group of exhausted leaders argue behind closed doors. In our timeline, these are the final hours of the Soviet Union. Within a day, the red flag will be lowered, and a superpower will disappear from the world stage. But tonight, something is different. In this alternate world, the men in that room, hardliners, reformers, generals, party elders, realize that letting the Soviet Union collapse will not bring democracy, or freedom, or prosperity. It will bring chaos, ethnic violence, economic freefall, a fractured nuclear empire, and perhaps the end of Russia itself. So instead of resigning, instead of surrendering to history, they make a desperate deal to keep the Union alive. Gorbachev is eased out quietly for health reasons. Yeltsin is assigned a symbolic post that strips him of real power. A new coalition emerges, part KGB, part technocrat, part old guard, and announces that the Soviet Union will not dissolve. It will reform, evolve, survive. The world wakes up to the news with shock. The United States cannot believe it. Europe is stunned. And inside the Soviet republics, Ukraine, the Baltics, Georgia, Kazakhstan, people stare at their TV screens and wonder, is this another trick? Or the beginning of something new? In those first months of 1992, the Soviet Union becomes a strange in-between creature. It is not the old totalitarian state, but it is not a free democracy either. It is a wounded giant trying to stay upright. Food shortages still haunt the markets. People still wait in long lines for basic goods. But the sudden shock therapy, the overnight privatization, the wild capitalism of our timeline never arrives. Instead, reforms happen slowly, cautiously, with the state keeping tight control. Factories that once produced tanks and tractors now try to make consumer goods. Foreign companies are allowed in, but only through joint ventures supervised by ministries that still carry the red star. A new class rises quietly. The red billionaires, former party families and security chiefs who control oil, gas, metals, and telecoms. They don't seize assets overnight, like in our world. They simply stay in charge, reshaping state enterprises into empires of their own. Life in the republics changes too. Ukraine remains inside the Union, but nationalism grows beneath the surface. Young people debate independence in cafes and dormitories. In the Baltics, hundreds of thousands march demanding freedom, waving their old flags defiantly. The Soviet central government responds with a mix of concessions and pressure. More local languages in schools, more cultural autonomy, but also more police, more surveillance, more subtle threats. Europe watches nervously. Germany is unified, but not fully pulled into NATO the way it was in our timeline. Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, is stuck between two futures. They are no longer Soviet satellites, but they are not fully Western democracies either. The region becomes a political twilight zone, a place where elections exist, but the deeper structures of power still bow toward Moscow. As the 1990s unfold, the United States faces a world very different from the one we know. There is no unipolar moment, no triumphant victory lap. Washington still sees itself as the victor of the Cold War. Capitalism clearly works better than Soviet socialism, but the rival superpower is still there, limping, struggling, but not dead. Every NATO decision, every intervention, every diplomatic move is made under the shadow of what will Moscow do. The world is calmer in some ways, more dangerous in others. Without a collapsed Russia, the wars in the Balkans are smaller. The West and the Soviet Union jointly pressure local leaders to avoid total chaos. But in the Caucasus, inside the USSR itself, conflicts simmer constantly. Chechnya, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, each one is a bruise that never fully heals. Bombings, insurgencies, crackdowns. The Soviet news cycles are filled with tragedies that the West can only guess at. And then comes the 2000s, a new century, a new generation of Soviet leaders. They grew up watching the system fail in the 80s, survive in the 90s, and now they want to reshape it in the 2000s. Their model isn't Marx or Lenin. Their inspiration is Deng Xiaoping. They look at China's booming economy and think, we can do that. We can keep the party and open the economy. We can be modern without becoming Western. Special economic zones appear in Odessa, Riga, Almaty, Vladivostok. Foreign investors are invited, carefully, cautiously, always under supervision. Private businesses are allowed, especially in technology, retail, and entertainment. But the core of the economy, energy, natural resources, heavy industry remains under the firm grip of the state and the red oligarchs. At the same time, the Internet arrives. And from day one, the Soviet leadership decides it will not repeat the mistakes of the past. The Internet is allowed but watched, encouraged but contained. Soviet social media companies rise quickly, alternatives to Google, Facebook, Twitter, designed to connect citizens, entertain them, and quietly monitor them. It becomes a hybrid of the Chinese firewall and the Russian internet culture we know, but on a massive multi-republic scale. Meanwhile, in the West, 9/11 changes everything. The United States invades Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union, with its own painful memories in that country, shakes its head and warns, this will not end quickly. When the U.S. moves toward invading Iraq, the Soviet Union joins France, Germany, and China in the strongest anti-war coalition the world has seen in decades. The result is a global political map, very different from ours. Not a world dominated by the United States, but a world where every move is negotiated among three giants: Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. As the 2010s arrive, the Soviet Union still stands. Tired, authoritarian, uneven, but standing. Ukraine is restless. Mass protests erupt in Kyiv, demanding real democracy, real autonomy, maybe even independence. The Soviet leadership tries to contain it with a mixture of force and compromise. There is no full-scale war, but there is no peace either. The whole world watches, anxious, unsure whether the USSR will finally crack after 2 decades of survival. China rises beside it, sometimes partner, sometimes rival. Together they form a kind of red axis, a counterweight to American influence. Europe, stuck in the middle, struggles to define itself. NATO expands more slowly, carefully, always aware that pushing too far might provoke a Soviet response. And the ordinary citizen, in Moscow, in Kyiv, in Riga, in Tbilisi, in Vladivostok, lives a life shaped by contradictions. More freedom than their parents had, but still watched. More prosperity than the Soviet 80s, but far behind the West. More hope than the 90s, but less clarity than the 2000s in our world. A life suspended between old ideals and new realities. By the 2020s, the world feels like a 3-player chess game. Not one superpower dominating everything. Not 2 superpowers locked in a Cold War. But 3 giants, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, constantly maneuvering, bargaining, clashing in cyber attacks, economic sanctions, space races, diplomatic crisis. Globalization still exists, but it's fractured. Your smartphone might be built with American chips, Chinese screens, and Soviet software. Your social media feed might show 3 different versions of the same event, depending on which country is telling the story. International alliances look less like stable partnerships and more like shifting sand, every nation trying to survive between the giants. And hanging over everything is a heavier nuclear shadow than the one we know. Because the Soviet arsenal never shrank the way Russia's did. Because NATO never pushed as far east. Because the old Cold War never fully ended. It simply changed shape. So would this world be better than ours? It depends on who you ask. Some might say yes. The disastrous privatizations of the 1990s never happened. Millions didn't lose their life savings. Some wars might have been avoided. The United States might have been more restrained without the feeling of total victory. But others would say no. Many nations that are free today would still be trapped inside an uncomfortable federation. Democracy would be slower, weaker, more uncertain. The map of Eastern Europe would be a cage rather than a home. And the constant tension between superpowers would keep the world closer to the edge of conflict. The truth is simple and unsettling. If the Soviet Union had never collapsed, the world would not be more peaceful. It would simply be less predictable. The 21st century would begin not with American triumph, but with a long, complicated standoff. A world where history never ended, where ideology never fully died, and where the future feels permanently unfinished. And so we return to that winter night in 1991, standing outside the Kremlin as the snow falls on the cobblestones. Inside the walls, the red flag still flies. History, which in our timeline broke open and scattered into 15 new nations, remains frozen in place. Perhaps saved, perhaps imprisoned, perhaps both. Now the question is yours. If you had to live in that world, a world where the Soviet Union survived, would you want to? And more importantly, what does your answer say about the world we live in today and the future we're still trying to build?